I didn't plan to change. I didn't feel bored. I didn't want out. But somewhere along the way, I started liking myself more. Not because of anything dramatic. Not because of passion or rebellion. Just quiet moments where I felt sharper, lighter, more present. And then one thought scared me more than any temptation ever could. I liked who I was becoming, just not with him. I'm a woman in my early 30s, in a long-term relationship that looks solid from the outside. We live together, share routines, and talk about the future like people who assume it's already decided. I wasn't looking for attention. I wasn't chasing excitement. I wasn't trying to replace my partner or create a problem. This started during a normal season of life: work, responsibilities, predictable days. Nothing broken, nothing urgent. At least, that's what I believed at the time. I didn't wake up wanting something else. I just slowly became someone else, without noticing when it started. And by the time I questioned it, I wasn't sure whether the real issue was my relationship, or the version of myself I no longer felt like being inside it. Have you ever realized you were changing before understanding why? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories like this, subscribe and share this story. At the beginning, nothing felt wrong enough to question. My days followed a familiar rhythm. Wake up, work, come home, dinner. Conversations that sounded the same no matter the day. Not bad conversations, just predictable ones. My partner wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant in any obvious way. He didn't neglect me or give me a reason to feel justified in doubting us. That's what made everything harder to understand. The change didn't start with another person. It started with me noticing things about myself. At work, I began speaking up more, sharing ideas without overthinking them, laughing without feeling like I needed to explain myself afterward. I felt sharper, more awake, like parts of me that had gone quiet were slowly coming back online. And I didn't connect that feeling to my relationship at first. Why would I? At home, nothing had gone wrong. But I noticed how often I edited myself before speaking, how I simplified my thoughts, how I chose comfort over curiosity. Again, not because my partner demanded it, but because that's what our dynamic had quietly become. One afternoon, after a long meeting, I caught my reflection in a glass wall at work. I looked tired, but focused, different. I remember thinking, I like this version of me. That thought should have felt empowering. Instead, it unsettled me, because I couldn't remember the last time I felt that way at home. I tried to shake it off. People evolve. Relationships go through phases. Not every season needs analysis, but once the thought existed, it kept returning. Not loudly, not accusingly. Just a soft question in the back of my mind. When did I stop growing here? That night, my partner talked about plans, practical things, future logistics. I nodded, I agreed. I played my role perfectly. But inside, something felt misaligned, like I was saying yes to a version of myself I wasn't sure I still fit into. I didn't feel tempted. I didn't feel trapped. I felt unfinished, and I didn't know yet how dangerous that feeling could become. At this point, was I overthinking normal change, or ignoring the first sign of something deeper? After that realization, I told myself to slow down. Not emotionally, mentally. I started paying closer attention to my own reactions, trying to understand where they were coming from, instead of letting them drift past me unnoticed. At home, I listened more carefully to my partner's words, not to judge them, but to see how they landed inside me. Some conversations still felt warm, familiar, comforting in the way old routines can be. Others felt flat, not wrong, just absent of the energy I'd started to notice in myself during the day. That contrast made me uncomfortable, so I tried to fix it quietly. I initiated deeper conversations, asked questions I hadn't asked in a long time, tried to bring pieces of myself into the space between us again. My partner responded, not perfectly, but sincerely, which made it harder to blame him for anything I was feeling. That's when I realized this wasn't about effort or neglect. It was about direction. Somewhere along the way, we had learned how to coexist beautifully, but I wasn't sure we were still evolving together. At work, the environment encouraged growth in subtle ways. People challenged my ideas. They listened when I spoke. I felt seen for my thoughts, not just my role. That didn't mean work was more important than my relationship, but it did mean it was activating something inside me. I began asking myself questions I had avoided for years. Was I becoming more myself, or just someone new? And if it was the latter, did that automatically make my relationship wrong? I didn't share these thoughts with anyone, not my partner, not friends. They felt too delicate, too easy to misunderstand. Because admitting them out loud would force me to accept something I wasn't ready to face yet. That loving someone doesn't always mean you're still becoming your best self beside them. And that possibility scared me more than any external temptation ever could. If growth starts to happen in different directions, is holding on still an act of love, or just fear of change? Once I admitted to myself that something inside me was shifting, I couldn't unsee it. It was like adjusting the focus on a camera. Nothing in the frame had changed, but suddenly, the details were sharper, and the blur I had lived with for years was gone. I started noticing how often I softened my opinions at home, how I chose words that kept things smooth instead of words that felt true. Not because my partner asked me to, but because I had learned, over time, that harmony mattered more than exploration. And for a long time, that had felt like maturity. But now, it felt like compression. At work, I didn't feel the need to compress myself. If I disagreed, I said so. If I was excited, it showed. If I was uncertain, I asked questions without apologizing for taking up space. I wasn't louder. I wasn't reckless. I was just more present. And that presence didn't disappear when the workday ended. It followed me home. I would sit across from my partner at dinner and feel a strange disconnect. Not emotional distance, but temporal distance, like we were living in the same place but moving at different speeds. I tried to slow myself down to match him, tried to tuck away the energy that felt inconvenient at home. But suppressing growth doesn't make it go away. It just turns it inward. Some nights, I lay awake replaying conversations from the day, not because they were inappropriate, but because they made me feel capable, engaged, challenged. And that led to a thought I hated having. What if the problem wasn't that my relationship was failing, but that it was succeeding at keeping me exactly as I was? That thought felt disloyal, ungrateful. This relationship had given me safety, history, a shared language of inside jokes and quiet routines. Who was I to question that? Yet the question didn't go away. Because the version of myself I was becoming didn't feel reckless or impulsive. She felt grounded, aware, alive in a way I hadn't noticed I'd been missing. And I didn't know how to reconcile that with the life I had built. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't want to disappear. And for the first time, I wondered if those two desires were quietly pulling me in opposite directions. If staying requires shrinking parts of yourself, is it still loyalty, or self-abandonment dressed as commitment? I started questioning my own narrative. For years, I had believed that stability was the goal, that if things were calm, predictable, and functional, that meant they were working, and in many ways, they were. We paid bills on time. We respected each other's space. We didn't fight often. From the outside, our relationship looked like something people aim for. That made my internal conflict feel illegitimate. How could I explain dissatisfaction when nothing was technically wrong? How could I justify doubt when I wasn't being mistreated or ignored? So instead of questioning the relationship, I questioned myself. Maybe I was restless. Maybe I was idealizing change. Maybe this was just what adulthood felt like. The slow trade of intensity for reliability. I told myself these things repeatedly, hoping one of them would settle into truth. But then there were moments that didn't fit that explanation. Small ones. Like how I felt energized after conversations that challenged my thinking. How I felt drained after conversations that revolved around logistics and repetition. How I began craving depth, not drama. At home, I noticed how often we talked around things instead of into them. We discussed schedules, plans, responsibilities, the architecture of a shared life, rarely the interior. I tried to open that door a few times, not dramatically, just gently. I would mention a thought I'd been sitting with, a question about where we were heading, a feeling I couldn't fully articulate yet. My partner listened. He always did. But his responses stayed practical. Solution-oriented, grounded. That used to feel reassuring. Now, it felt like we were speaking different emotional languages without realizing it. I wasn't looking for conflict. I wasn't asking for reassurance or validation. I was trying to be known again. And the more I tried, the more aware I became of how much effort it took to translate myself at home, at work, and in other spaces. I didn't need to translate. I could exist as I was becoming, without explanation. That realization came with a wave of guilt, because I wasn't being pulled away by someone else. I was being pulled forward by myself. And I didn't know how to reconcile that with loyalty to a relationship built on who I used to be. I started to wonder something I had never allowed myself to consider before. What if the relationship wasn't wrong, but it also wasn't right anymore? That question terrified me, not because of the answer, but because of what asking it meant. Once you admit a question like that exists, you can't pretend you're just passing through a phase. You have to face the possibility that staying might require compromise, and leaving might require courage you're not sure you have. And I wasn't ready to choose yet. If a relationship fits your past perfectly but your present awkwardly, is it something to protect? Or something to re-examine honestly? By the time these thoughts became consistent, I realized I was carrying them everywhere. They weren't loud. They didn't interrupt my day in obvious ways. They just sat with me, during commutes, while brushing my teeth, in the quiet moments before sleep. I started noticing how carefully I managed my emotional energy. At home, I conserved it. I chose calm over curiosity, ease over honesty. Not because my partner demanded that of me, but because I had learned, slowly, unintentionally, that depth made things heavier, and lightness kept things smooth. At work, I didn't manage myself the same way. I asked questions without worrying about tone. I explored ideas without immediately simplifying them. I felt mentally stretched, and instead of resisting that feeling, I leaned into it. That contrast became impossible to ignore. One evening, my partner asked me how my day had been. It was a normal question, a caring one. I paused longer than usual before answering. Not because I didn't want to talk, but because I didn't know which version of my day I was allowed to bring home. The one that fit neatly into our rhythm, or the one that reflected who I was becoming. I chose the familiar version, the edited one, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt it again. That subtle sense of self-betrayal I had started to recognize. It wasn't about lying. I wasn't hiding facts. I was hiding myself. That realization hit harder than any temptation ever could have. Because temptation implies desire for something else. What I was feeling was a growing discomfort with staying the same. That night, I sat alone after my partner went to bed, replaying the past few months in my head. Nothing dramatic stood out. No clear turning point. Just a slow accumulation of moments where I chose ease over expression. I asked myself a question I had avoided until then. If nothing changes, who do I become 5 years from now? The answer that came wasn't tragic. It wasn't devastating. It was quiet and deeply unsettling. I saw a version of myself who was stable, reliable, loved, and quietly disconnected from her own inner life. And I realized that my fear wasn't about losing my partner. It was about losing the version of myself I had just started to recognize again. That scared me more than any potential consequence of honesty. Because once you see that future clearly, pretending you don't becomes its own kind of choice. If staying means slowly letting go of who you're becoming, is that still commitment? Or is it a decision made out of comfort rather than truth? Once I accepted that avoiding the decision was, in itself, a decision, everything felt heavier. Not dramatic, just weighted. Like carrying a truth in my chest offering no urgency, but no relief either. I started noticing how often I postponed clarity. I'll think about this later. I just need more time. Things will settle. But nothing settles when the issue isn't external. The relationship didn't suddenly become worse. If anything, it stayed consistent, steady, reliable, safe. And that consistency began to feel like a mirror held too close. Every routine highlighted the contrast between who I was becoming internally and who I was expected to remain externally. I wasn't angry at my partner. That made everything more complicated. Anger gives permission to act. Resentment creates a villain. I had neither. Instead, I had someone who trusted me, assumed continuity, and believed we were simply moving forward the way couples do when nothing is wrong. That trust made my silence feel heavier, because I wasn't withholding out of fear of conflict. I was withholding because I didn't yet know what I was asking for. One evening, we sat together without distractions. No phones, no television, just space. He talked about something minor, plans, logistics, a thought about the future. I listened, nodded, responded where expected. And then there was a pause. Not an awkward one, a natural opening. I felt the words rise in my chest. Not a confession, not a breakup, just honesty. I've been feeling different lately. That's all I had to say. But I didn't, because I knew what would follow. Questions, concern, the expectation that I explained something I was still trying to understand myself. And I wasn't ready to offer half answers that might change everything. So I stayed quiet. And in that moment, I understood something painful. I wasn't choosing him, but I also wasn't choosing myself. I was choosing delay, and delay isn't neutral. Delay slowly rewrites reality while pretending nothing has shifted. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because I felt misaligned. Like living one version of my life during the day and another version in my head at night. I realized then that the longer I stayed silent, the harder honesty would become. Not because it would hurt more, but because it would sound less believable. And that terrified me. Because the story I would eventually tell would be true, but it would also come with the question I was most afraid to answer. Why did you wait so long? And I didn't know if I had an answer that wouldn't make me look like someone I didn't want to be. If you know clarity will change everything, is waiting a form of care, or just a way to avoid accountability? By that point, the weight of knowing without acting had settled into something constant. Not panic. Not urgency. Just a low, persistent pressure, like living slightly out of sync with your own body. I went through my days functioning normally. Work, conversations, smiles in the right places. From the outside, nothing looked unstable, but internally, everything felt provisional. I stopped thinking in certainties and started thinking in ifs. If I speak now, if I wait longer, if I stay, if I leave. Each option carried consequences I couldn't fully see yet, which made inaction feel safer, at least temporarily. What surprised me most was how lonely this process felt. Not because I lacked support, but because the questions I was asking couldn't be shared easily without already pointing toward an outcome. Talking about doubt changes things. It reframes the past. It puts the future on trial. So I kept carrying it alone. At home, I became more attentive in small ways. Not out of guilt, but out of uncertainty. I cooked more. I listened more closely. I tried to reconnect through familiarity, hoping the feeling would return if I recreated enough shared moments. And sometimes, it almost did. There were evenings that felt warm again, laughs that came easily, comfort that reminded me why I had chosen this life in the first place. Those moments confused me more than the emptiness ever had, because they made me question whether I was imagining the disconnect, whether this was just a temporary misalignment I was overanalyzing. But then, inevitably, the feeling would return. Not dissatisfaction, but a quiet sense of mismatch. Like wearing something that still fits, but no longer feels like your style. I noticed how often I adjusted myself to maintain ease, lowered the intensity of my thoughts, softened my curiosity, simplified my questions. Not because my partner rejected those parts of me, but because he didn't naturally meet them. And I didn't want to force him into a version of connection that wasn't his. That realization brought a different kind of guilt. Not the guilt of wanting more, but the guilt of knowing that wanting something different doesn't make the current situation wrong. It just makes it incomplete. I started asking myself questions that felt unfair, but necessary. Was I allowed to want a relationship that grew at the same pace I did? Was it selfish to feel misaligned even when treated well? Was love supposed to feel this quiet? Or had I just learned to accept quiet as stability? None of those questions had clean answers. And the hardest part was admitting this to myself. If I stayed, I would eventually resent the parts of myself I kept minimizing. If I left, I would grieve a relationship that had never truly failed. Either way, something would be lost. That's when I understood why this decision felt so heavy. There was no villain, no betrayal, no dramatic breaking point, just two people growing honestly, but not in the same direction anymore. And I still didn't know which truth I was more afraid to live with. If both staying and leaving come with regret, is the real choice about which regret you're willing to carry long term. Once I reached that understanding, everything slowed down. Not in my life, but in my perception of it. I stopped reacting automatically and started observing myself in real time, almost as if I were watching someone else move through familiar spaces. At home, I noticed how often I anticipated my partner's needs before my own, not out of love alone, but out of habit. Years of learning each other's rhythms had taught me how to keep things smooth without thinking. That skill used to feel like intimacy. Now, it felt like self-erasure in small, acceptable doses. I wasn't unhappy. That's what made it so confusing. There were still good days, still affection, still shared memories that meant something to me. But underneath all of it, there was a growing awareness that I was no longer fully present in the life I was maintaining. I began to realize how often I lived in anticipation rather than engagement. Anticipating the next phase, the next adjustment, the next version of myself I might eventually allow to exist. And the more I noticed that pattern, the harder it became to ignore its consequences. One night, after a long and emotionally draining day, my partner hugged me from behind while I was standing in the kitchen. It was gentle, familiar, comforting in the way only long-term intimacy can be. And yet, something inside me stayed still, not resistant, not cold, just absent. That moment terrified me, not because I didn't feel love, but because I didn't feel alignment. I realized then that I had been using effort as a substitute for truth. Trying harder, showing up more, doing all the right things, but effort can't manufacture authenticity. You can perform commitment flawlessly and still feel disconnected from the person performing it. That night, I admitted something to myself I had been avoiding for months. The problem wasn't that I wanted something else. The problem was that I wanted to become someone I could no longer fully be here. And that realization came with a kind of grief I wasn't prepared for. Grief for a future that still looked good on paper. Grief for a relationship that hadn't failed, but had reached its natural limit. Grief for the version of myself who once fit perfectly into this life. I understood then why so many people stay longer than they should. Not out of weakness, but out of respect for what something once was. Leaving felt like rewriting history in a way I wasn't sure I had the right to do. But staying began to feel like slowly abandoning the present. And that's when I realized the decision wasn't about love versus freedom. It was about honesty versus comfort. And once that question presents itself clearly, pretending it isn't there becomes its own kind of lie. If you know staying will require you to keep quiet about who you're becoming, is silence still kindness, or just fear wearing a softer name? By the time I reached that conclusion, I was no longer confused about what I was feeling. I was conflicted about what I was willing to do with it. There's a difference between understanding yourself and acting on that understanding. One brings clarity, the other brings consequences, and I was standing right between the two. I started imagining what honesty would actually look like. Not the abstract idea of it, but the real version. The one with pauses, with misunderstandings, with the risk of saying something that can't be taken back. I wasn't afraid of hurting my partner intentionally. I was afraid of hurting him honestly, because honest pain doesn't come with a clear justification. There's no villain to point to, no mistake to highlight, just a truth that lands heavily because it's real. I thought about the life we had built together, not just the routines, but the shared decisions, the compromises that had made sense at the time, the future we talked about as if it were already agreed upon. Breaking that rhythm felt almost disrespectful, as if questioning it now meant invalidating everything that came before. But I knew that wasn't true. Growth doesn't erase the past. It just refuses to live entirely inside it. Still, I struggled with the timing. Why now? Why after years of stability? Why when nothing had gone wrong? Those questions haunted me because I didn't have answers that would sound reasonable to anyone else. And maybe that was the point. Not all truths are reasonable. Some are simply accurate. One evening, my partner mentioned something small, a plan for the next few months, spoken casually, with confidence that I was still standing beside him in the same way I always had. I felt a tightening in my chest. Not panic, not sadness, responsibility. I realized that every day I stayed silent, I was participating in a future I wasn't sure I could fully inhabit anymore, and that felt unfair, not just to me, but to him. Because he deserved a partner who was choosing him freely, not someone staying out of habit or fear of disruption. That realization didn't give me courage immediately, but it removed my last excuse. I couldn't pretend I was protecting him by staying quiet. I was protecting myself from discomfort. And once I admitted that, the shape of the decision became clearer, even if the outcome still terrified me. I didn't know exactly what I would say yet. I didn't know when. But I knew something had to change, because living in alignment with myself had started to matter more than preserving the appearance of certainty. And the hardest part wasn't imagining what I might lose. It was accepting that staying silent would mean losing myself slowly, and doing it willingly. That night, I understood something with painful clarity. The longer you delay an honest choice, the more that choice begins to define you anyway. If you know silence is no longer neutral, do you owe honesty to your partner, even if it leads to an ending you never planned? I didn't plan a speech. There was no dramatic setup, no perfect timing, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It happened on an ordinary night. Dinner was over. The house was quiet. Nothing in the air suggested that something irreversible was about to be said. And that's exactly why I knew I couldn't wait anymore. I realized that if I kept looking for the right moment, I would keep postponing the truth indefinitely. Not because I lacked honesty, but because honesty rarely feels convenient. I sat with my partner and told him I needed to talk. Not urgently, not emotionally charged, just honestly. I didn't start by blaming the relationship. I didn't list problems. I didn't say he had failed me, because he hadn't. I told him that I had been changing, that I had felt myself growing in ways I hadn't expected, that I had tried to fit that growth into our relationship quietly, hoping it would settle, hoping I could make it align without disrupting everything we had built. And then I said the hardest part out loud, that I liked who I was becoming, but I didn't feel like I could fully be her here anymore. The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. He listened. Not defensively, not angrily. Just present. And that made everything hurt more. He asked questions, calm ones, thoughtful ones, not to argue, but to understand. I answered them as honestly as I could, even when the answers made me uncomfortable. Especially then. I didn't say this meant I wanted to leave immediately. I didn't say I was certain about what came next. But I did say that staying without addressing this would eventually turn into resentment, and that I didn't want to become that person. We talked for hours, about who we used to be, about how we had grown together, and how, somewhere along the way, that growth had started to diverge. There were tears, not dramatic ones, quiet ones. The kind that come from realizing something meaningful may be ending without ever having failed. In the days that followed, we gave each other space, not out of anger, but out of respect. We didn't rush a conclusion. We didn't pretend nothing had changed. And eventually, we made a decision that didn't feel victorious or tragic. It felt honest. We chose to let go. Not because love was gone, but because staying would have required one of us to become smaller to keep the other comfortable. And that isn't what commitment is supposed to look like. Leaving was painful. Staying would have been quieter, but far more damaging in the long run. I learned that sometimes the bravest choice isn't choosing someone else. It's choosing not to abandon yourself slowly, while convincing everyone you're fine. I didn't cheat. I didn't betray him. But I did almost betray myself. And facing that before it turned into something darker was the hardest, and most necessary, thing I've ever done. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.